red man's dream was to fly across the face of his land. It was not to be. He had to be content to imitate the eagle he revered and envied. The white man was not so easily satisfied. Already he had succeeded in soaring through the air. Soon his winged shadow would fall across the face of the red man's land. At the beginning of a new century, Oklahoma could boast a new breed of men. Adventurous men with the courage to come out to the raw, untamed land, determined to conquer it. They looked at the wide land and the blue sky and sighted far down the future. And the guts to wrest the precious black gold from a resisting land. Flying was a challenge that could not be ignored. They plunged into it as daringly and wholeheartedly as they had plunged their fortunes and their futures into wildcatting oil wells. And it paid off equally well. The day would come when it would outstrip the oil business in economic impact on their hard-won homeland. The beginnings, the struggles, the failures, and the ultimate triumphs of aviation in Oklahoma are here for us to see as we explore 60 years of aviation with an Oklahoma accent.
Aviation is a universal language, but it has an Oklahoma accent, perhaps because it was spoken here so early and so continuously. The aviation industry had its beginning in many parts of the world. In most, it was a late child, adopted into an already mature economy. In Oklahoma, the infant industry and the lusty young state grew up together, their destinies inextricably entwined. It began in 1910. The 3-year-old state had a new capital, Oklahoma City, and it was here that the state's first known airplane flight took place. Charles F. Willard and his pusher biplane were the main attractions at an air show. Willard shipped his fragile butterfly to Oklahoma City in furniture crates. He thrilled the spectators with a breathtaking flight covering all of 500 yards and rising to the startling height of 75 feet above the ground. Later that same year, the state saw its first aerial circus at the old Oklahoma City Fairgrounds. Daring, exciting show was made up of 6 staggering, temperamental early-day aircraft and 15 dashing aviators. There were other events going on that would leave their mark on global aviation. Out in western Oklahoma, a young Kansas farmer, Clyde Cessna, was testing his experimental aircraft over the salt plains near Cherokee. In later years, Cessna went on to Wichita, Kansas, to establish the company, which is now one of the world's 2 greatest manufacturers of private aircraft. Just 5 years later, 1915, Southwest Oklahoma served as the backdrop for the nation's first military airlift. An entire squadron was relocated in a dramatic flying caravan from Fort Sill near Lawton to San Antonio's Fort Sam Houston. Not a man was scratched, not a plane faltered. Nor was there any faltering when the airplane was called upon to play a new role in history. In Europe, international tensions engulfed the continent in World War I. Those accepted in the fledgling air forces of France and England learned to fly in the sputtering Sopwiths and Newports that were to usher in a new era, the era of military aviation. The first commercial production of airplanes in Oklahoma got underway in 1917 at Dewey, on acreage donated by Joe Bartles, a dynamic go-getter for whom the city of Bartlesville is named. That first facility, the Dewey Aircraft Company, was built to fulfill a government contract for 20 Curtiss Jenny flight trainers. This was the rugged, lovable Jenny, which began the adventurous careers of many of our country's aviation pioneers. The Jenny kept post-war aviation alive and breathing. Engineer and chief pilot of the Dewey Aircraft Company was Billy Parker, the same ingenious Billy Parker who developed the variable pitch propeller which helped immeasurably in the advance of aviation. Billy recently retired as aviation sales manager of Phillips Petroleum Company, a job in which he often made personal appearances with his old Curtiss-type pusher. The plane now hangs in the lobby at Tulsa International Airport. In 1920, the first municipal airport was established at Oklahoma City. Bennett Griffin and Mark Adams were in charge. Today, Will Rogers World Airport serves its state and nation through its jet-age facilities. The early 1920s were oil boom days in Oklahoma, and it was natural that oil speculators, with their flair for the new and different, would turn to the airplane. It was new, it was practical, it gave them speed and mobility to get around the country, sniffing out new oil discoveries. So it was the expanding oil industry that gave a hearty push to aviation in the land of the red man. The rush to build new airports got its start in those black gold days. By 1928, Oklahoma could count 42 airfields within its borders. True, they were primitive, but they were mighty valuable to the nation's airmen and to the cities of Oklahoma: Bartlesville, Clinton, Chickasha, Tulsa, Claremore, Hominy, Healdton, and 3 dozen others. The year before that, though, 1927, that a young Army aviator and movie stunt flyer named Arthur Goebel got interested in the $25,000 offered by Jim Dole, wealthy Hawaiian known as the Pineapple King. Dole was inspired by Lindbergh's New York to Paris flight to set up a non-stop flight race from Oakland, California to Honolulu. He offered $25,000 first prize and $10,000 second prize. Goebel got Frank Phillips, founder of Phillips Petroleum Company, to finance a high-wing travel air named the Woolaroc for the woods, lake, and rocks on Phillips Ranch. Bennett Griffin entered another travel air named the Oklahoma. 8 airplanes took off from Oakland. The Oklahoma, first to leave, was back in a few minutes with 5 engine cylinders blown out. Only 2 airplanes made the 2,740 overwater miles. The Woolaroc was first. The airplane now hangs in the Woolaroc Museum near Bartlesville. In 1928, the University of Oklahoma became the first Southwestern university to offer flight training. A former truck factory in the tiny eastern Oklahoma community of OK produced its entire lifetime aviation output: 2 small low-wing monoplanes. Although the OK airplane died in its infancy, one of its 2 engineers went on to become an Oklahoma gift to commercial and military aviation and to space research and development. He is Lee Atwood, now president of North American Rockwell. Spartan's first in a long line of superb private aircraft was the C-3-120. The C-3 preceded the 1934 and 1937 executives built by Spartan. The 1937 Executive was probably the first airplane built on a production line basis in Oklahoma. An air tour by the Tulsa Chamber of Commerce in 1928 visited 40 towns in northeastern Oklahoma. It crystallized the belief in Tulsans' minds that the oil capital of the world needed a city airport. To get it, pioneer oilman W.G. Bill Skelly rounded up 47 civic leaders and corporations to sign a stud horse note or gentleman's agreement. Pledging $172,000 to buy the land where Tulsa's Years Ahead International Airport now stands. But an airport needs airlines. One of the first in the Southwest was started by Paul Braniff. Using 5-place Stinson Detroiters, its route was between Tulsa and Oklahoma City. After Paul sold his interest in the airline, his brother Tom took over. Tom put past Lockheed Vegas on the route to start it toward its present-day success as an international air carrier. Another of today's airline giants was to have its beginnings in the same area shortly afterward. Earl Halliburton was among the shrewd businessmen who saw great potential in the speed of the flying machine for moving people and things from anywhere to anywhere else. With a handful of the remarkable Ford trimotors, nicknamed the Tin Goose, he set up Southwest Air Fast Express in 1929. Working out of Tulsa, it served Oklahoma City, Dallas, Fort Worth, Kansas City, and St. Louis. It was the seed from which American Airlines grew. By 1930, Will Rogers, native of Oologah, Oklahoma, was flying high as a celebrity. The homespun wit and philosophy of this internationally famous cowboy Indian were boosting his home state throughout the world. He had also become the world's best-known booster of air travel. It had to happen that Will would meet another famous Oklahoman closely associated with aviation. The year was 1931, July. Will was headed home to Claremore to dedicate a new airport bearing his name. At the same time, a one-eyed ex-parachute jumper named Wiley Post and his navigator Harold Gaddy from Australia were in Tulsa. They had just returned from a trip around the world. In Post's Lockheed Vega, the Winnie Mae, now almost as famous as the Spirit of St. Louis, they had made the 16,500 miles in the astonishing time of about 8.5 days. Will and Wiley had a mutual friend and fun-loving Charlie Short, the airport manager at Tulsa. Charlie brought the two famous men together in the Tulsa Hotel, where Wiley was being honored with a banquet. They became friends on the spot. Wiley flew Will to the Claremore ceremonies the next day. It was the first of many flights they were to make together, including their last, which ended so tragically at Point Barrow, Alaska in 1935. The National Air Races came to Oklahoma City in 1933, less than 3 months before Wiley Post once more drew international attention to his Oklahoma heritage by circumnavigating the globe again. This time he was alone and set another world record. This flight, like all his flights, contributed to the scientific knowledge of aviation. Post put a newly developed Sperry automatic pilot into the Winnie Mae and proved beyond question that it was a completely dependable instrument. It flew the Winnie Mae for him while he slept, off and on for a total of only 20 hours during the 7 days, 18 hours, 49 minutes it took him to fly the 15,596 miles. But Oklahoma's Wiley Post was a long way from finished with his questions about what makes aviation tick. He had a consuming, tireless curiosity about flying, faultless vision for the future of world aviation. His scientific probing into the little-known skies helped to give the world the automatic pilot, the radio direction finder, knowledge of the jet stream, and the astronaut's spacesuit. The pressurized suit, diminutive Wiley Post invented it. He wanted to break existing transcontinental speed records. He felt the way to do it was to get into the stratosphere, where the air is thin and the speed and efficiency of an airplane could be improved. The toughest problem was man. He would need oxygen at 50,000 feet or more high in the sky. He would need the right air pressure to keep his body from exploding. Earlier, Post had worked out a pressurization system to prevent leakage of electricity from radio lines at high altitudes. Now he applied the principle to a suit for himself. Phillips Petroleum Company backed him all the way, not only with money for preparation and research and development and for flight costs, but by having developed a special gasoline for the stratosphere. It took nearly a year, but Wiley Post hurdled all the obstacles and developed his primitive pressurized suit. Its patented principles still serve for today's highly sophisticated spacesuits. Except for modifications, today's astronaut wears a pressurized flight suit designed by Post and patented 25 years before man ventured into space. Without Post's clumsy suit and its ingenious built-in oxygen and pressurization system, there might not be any Oklahoma astronauts. Thomas Stafford, Gordon Cooper, William Pogue, Owen Garriott, Stuart Rosa. But back to Wiley Post, the reticent farm boy from the little Oklahoma community of Maysville. In 1934, Post made his altitude record, and in the process, found the jet streams. Today's jetliner pilots plot their cross-country flight plans to take advantage of these super winds, which have been clocked at well over 350 miles per hour. Post's round-the-world flights tested and proved the theories and instruments that make it possible for millions to fly safely to today at more than 10 miles above the Earth, and accelerated the advance of aviation and aerospace sciences. Wiley Post stood only 5 feet 5 inches tall, yet he is the undisputed giant of Oklahoma aviation. His stature spans the entire world. World War II. It was time for Oklahoma, like the rest of an aroused nation, to train young warriors to face the enemy in mortal combat. Oklahoma opened its wide land to a multitude of flight training bases, from Woodward to Durant, from Altus to Miami. They spread all over the red man's map. The first two were for the Royal Air Force, one at Miami and one at Ponca City. It was time for Oklahoma heroes of a high order, too. The magic names marched out of aviation's pioneering past. General Ira C. Aker, who made history with his endurance flight in 1929 as an Army captain aboard the famous Question Mark. He and his crew kept the old bird aloft over California for more than 150 hours. In World War II, he commanded brilliantly the Heavy Bomber Command of the 8th Air Force. It was he who made the massive daylight bombing raids on Germany a success. Jocko Clark, Cherokee Indian. Joseph J. Clark, an Annapolis man, served in the Navy with high distinction. In 1944, he became an admiral to command a vital group of the invincible Task Force 58. Task Force 58 was, in turn, commanded by another Oklahoman, Mark Mitcher, son of one of Oklahoma City's first mayors. Of Mitcher, Life magazine once wrote that he was among the few vice admirals who virtually ran American naval aviation in World War II. General Clarence L. Tinker, Oklahoma named Tinker Air Force Base for him. Part Osage Indian, commanding general of the 7th Air Force in Hawaii. He took part in the deadly bombing attack on the Japanese invasion forces in the Battle of Midway. He was the highest-ranking officer lost in combat by the United States forces up to that time. Listening to the thunder of World War II, Oklahoma turned to its share in the nation's impossible task of providing an umbrella of warplanes at the incredible rate of 50,000 per year to help fill President Roosevelt's arsenal for democracy.
I should like to see this nation geared up to the ability to turn out at least 50,000 planes a year.
Research and development on the Phillips Petroleum Company's alkylation process for production of superior high-octane fuel got underway in earnest. Late in 1942, the company opened its first alkylation plant and began disseminating knowledge about the process throughout the petroleum industry. Without this process, aviation gasoline for the warbirds of the free world would simply not have been available in adequate quantity. And today, all military jet fuel contains a Phillips-developed additive that prevents fuel line icing. These are only two of hundreds of contributions made by Phillips to aviation. In 1940, the Douglas plant was started in Tulsa. It opened for business in 1942. The windowless building cost $15 million, just a shade under a mile long. Its first assignment was the A-24 Dauntless dive bomber, a deadly ship killer. There followed sub-assemblies for the 4-engine B-24 Liberator bombers. While this was going on in the main plant, the government provided a $5 million center for modification of the B-17, the Flying Fortress. Nearly 4,000 of them went through the shops on Douglas North 40 at the Tulsa Airport. Next in the parade were the A-26 Invaders. Douglas produced over 1,300 of these attack bombers during the war. That was Tulsa. Meanwhile, Oklahoma City was carrying its own big share of the load. The government located another huge plant in the capital city. There, Douglas turned out thousands of C-47s, the indestructible Goonie bird, the military version of the famous DC-3, for Air Force support in faraway corners of a boiling world. In 1941, as the war clouds piled higher and higher in the international sky, the civic leaders of Oklahoma City vigorously plunged into the competition for a new War Department maintenance and supply depot. They won. Tinker Air Force Base was born. Its most spectacular charge was a particular B-29 Super Fortress. Later named Enola Gay by her heroic pilot, she and her crew were to change the face of the world. At 9:15 a.m. on August 6, 1945, she dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. The war ended 9 days later. An important contribution to civilian aviation was made in 1944 when 36 Oklahoma farmer airmen banded together on the Oklahoma State University campus at Stillwater to organize the Flying Farmers of America. It is now an international organization with tens of thousands of members, all dedicated to better farming through aviation. Oklahoma also has a chapter of flying physicians, medical men who use aircraft to reach patients in out-of-the-way places, or to attend conferences, or just to relax in their leisure hours. They are among many thousands of enthusiastic pilots who make the private flying picture in Oklahoma one of the healthiest and busiest in the nation. Sport flying is popular and widespread throughout the Sooner State. Sailplane pilots enjoy the feel of flying and the silent beauty among the clouds without the aid of engines. active chapters of the Antique Airplane Association and Experimental Aircraft Association keep alive the thrills and skills of pioneer pilots with their home-built birds and rebuilt replicas of the planes of an earlier era. They're of all ages, these private pilots, from all walks of life and all financial brackets. They have one thing in common, a common language of aviation. An Oklahoma City youngster named Mike Monroney was to become one of the world's most influential aviation enthusiasts. He became chairman of the powerful aviation subcommittee in the United States Senate in 1955. Today, he is known throughout the country as Mr. Aviation for his dedication to the many problems of civil aviation. Oklahoma City is blessed with the nation's University of Civil Aviation. This is the Federal Aviation Administration's Aeronautical Center at Will Rogers World Airport. Another 4,000 employees, $36,500,000 payroll. Here is where the agency's technical, flight, and management personnel get their indoctrination and advanced training. Here, too, is the free world central point for training airport tower controllers, radar operators, and other aviation technicians and management people from foreign nations throughout the world. Here they learn to speak the universal language of aviation with an Oklahoma accent. Mike Monroney tells it this way.
When I was flying off of the Franklin D. Roosevelt aircraft carrier off Turkey during some of their war games a few years back, and we were flying up over the Aegean Islands and going on to Athens, and then I was going on to Rome with this Navy aircraft, was returning there. The pilot asked if I wanted to come up in the cockpit and hear him file his flight plan. And he filed his flight plan just like he was coming into Oklahoma City or Tulsa or to Lawton or any place else in the United States. And they said, read it back. And I was amazed to hear this Greek control tower operator there in Athens, a flight going to Rome and having gone across the Aegean Islands, the cockpit of our civilization, reading back the flight plan as given to him exactly, but speaking English with an Oklahoma accent.
In 1958, Senator Monroney wrote the legislation which created the Federal Aviation Administration. It is the overseer and coordinator of all U.S. civil aviation. But before all this came to pass, the Korean incident called upon the state for help in the early 1950s. Through the Korean War, Tinker Air Force Base kept the supplies speeding to Southeast Asia through its main tenant, the Oklahoma City Air Materiel Command. Today, Tinker is Oklahoma's largest industry and one of the most massive complexes in the Southwest. It swarms with nearly 30,000 military and civilian employees. They take home $210 million in payroll each year. Its major function is support of the global operations of the B-52 bomber and its Hound Dog missile system. Tinker, along with Altus, Vance, and Clinton Sherman Air Force bases, generate a military and civilian payroll of more than $250 million each year. They keep nearly 40,000 Oklahomans on the job. In Tulsa, Douglas was spruced up and retooled. Between 1952 and 1956, it pushed more than 250 B-47 jet bombers out the door. The assembly lines were also crowded with modification work on the RB-66 attack bombers. Finally, more than half the Tulsans in the Douglas skilled workforce of 4,000 spend all their time working on Douglas DC-8 and DC-9 jetliners. Tulsa also had what American Airlines wanted, the Douglas Modification Center. A famous Oklahoman played Cupid in that love affair in 1946. He was big, affable Orville M. Mosier, known as Red the world around. Barnstormer, fighter pilot in Cuba, city manager of Oklahoma City. Finally, executive vice president of American Airlines. His airline wanted to set up housekeeping in good climate, in a pleasant, centrally located site for its system-wide maintenance and overhaul operations. Tulsa had everything to recommend it. Fine buildings, trained workforce left over from World War II, superb climate for flight testing, and location in the heart of the nation at the center of American's transcontinental flight pattern. But American grew from there. $25 million has been spent for new shops and hangars since 1957. America's space-age adventure came to Oklahoma in 1962. North American Aviation, now North American Rockwell, moved into the huge Tulsa plant with Douglas. They built their workforce to today's high of 5,200. These Oklahomans have a stake in space. They turn out major structures of the three-man Apollo spacecraft and massive sections of the second stage for the Apollo launch rocket. North American Rockwell has its own plant now. Its work is moving more and more into the commercial airplane area. The Tulsa division is a major subcontractor for Boeing's 727 Tri-Jet and 737 Twin-Jet commercial airliners. Just an hour's drive down the Indian Nation Turnpike at McAllister, North American and Lockheed are turning out important parts for both space and commercial aviation. At Bethany, a suburb of Oklahoma City, Aero Commander produces a steady stream of quality twin-engined executive aircraft. 2,000 more jobs for Oklahomans. In the big picture of Oklahoma aviation, more than 57,000 people work directly in what has become the state's second largest industry. The state's annual payroll in the aviation industry is approaching $500 million and rising steadily. From this, it is evident Oklahoma is soaring high on the national list of aviation accomplishments. Nearly every new plane on the drawing board or in the assembly line will fly with parts molded by the state's manufacturers. The state is not only a center for aeronautic contributions, but it lies midway between two oceans, a convenient location on the country's mapped highways of the skies. And with the utilization of the new C-5A, the equivalent of 6 containerized boxcars of cargo can be loaded in Tulsa or Oklahoma City and transported non-stop to international destinations. This revolution in aviation will eliminate the necessity of export-import businesses locating on an ocean. But Oklahoma's mark is not only evident on aircraft piloting the explored skyways. The state's industry has been a major contributor of rocket stages for the Apollo space program. More than just Oklahomans' goodwill will fly with the astronauts on their lunar missions. The horizons of the aerospace industry are boundless, and planning for the future is an exacting science, not only in aviation, but contributing interrelated industries. The state's place in the future is explained by Oklahoma's Governor Dewey Bartlett.
Oklahoma is very proud of its long partnership with aviation. This is a partnership that goes back to the early days of aviation and the early days of Oklahoma. Oklahoma, with its many pilots and aviation enthusiasts, the large number of airlines, the aviation manufacturing companies, the FAA, and many other aviation activities have contributed greatly to the progress and development of aviation. Today, Oklahoma is a transportation hub not only including aviation, but water transportation in 1970 to Tulsa and affecting the entire state. Oklahoma has a 4-lane highway system of limited access highways that ranks us 13th of all the states in the number of miles. We have a good rail system, and with 2 internationally rated airports and 209 total airports, we do affect the entire population with aviation transportation. As we move into the future, we see aviation and Oklahoma going together for progress of the nation.
The red man's dream of flight has become the white man's reality, and the red man is part of it, part of a new culture and a new world, where everyone speaks aviation with an Oklahoma accent.